I gave her everything, my savings, my trust, my name. She took all three and laughed about it with her mother the whole time. $430,000. Gone. And the worst part? I would have given her more if I hadn't found that phone. I remember the exact moment I decided I was done being lonely. I was sitting at my dining table in San Antonio, eating reheated chicken by myself, staring at 3 empty chairs that used to mean something. My marriage of 34 years had ended 4 years earlier, not in a fight, not in a dramatic blowout, but in a long, slow silence that neither of us had the energy to break. My daughter Stacy lived up in Dallas. My son Kevin was in Denver, always busy, always one text away, but somehow always somewhere else. I had a paid-off house, a healthy retirement account, and absolutely nothing to fill a Tuesday evening. That was my life. That was what 40 years of work had built, an empty table and the hum of a refrigerator. A friend of mine, a retired contractor named Bill, called me one afternoon in late February and told me he was joining a travel group for retirees. Organized trips, guided tours, structured enough to feel safe but loose enough to feel like you were actually living. He told me they were heading to Manila in the spring. I said no. He called again 2 weeks later. I said maybe. By March, I had a passport refreshed and a flight booked almost before I understood what I was doing. I told myself it was just a vacation. I told myself I needed a change of scenery. I told myself a lot of things that spring. Manila hit me like a warm fist. The noise, the color, the way the city moved at 11 at night like it was just getting started. I was 72 years old and I felt like I had stepped into a world that had no idea who I was, which meant I could be anyone. Our group was 14 people, mostly couples, a few solo travelers like me. On the third night, we ended up at a rooftop bar in BGC Bonifacio Global City, one of those places with glass walls and city lights rolling out below you in every direction. I was on my second bourbon, standing near the railing, when she walked in. I noticed her because she didn't look like someone who needed to be noticed. She was dressed cleanly, not flashily. Dark blazer, simple jewelry. She moved through that room like she owned a quiet piece of it. She was maybe 40. I guessed I found out later she was 44. She sat 2 seats down from me at the bar and ordered mineral water. I thought that was interesting. A rooftop bar with a view like that, and she ordered mineral water. I did not approach her. I want to be clear about that. She turned to me first. She said, "You're not from here," not as a question, just as a fact. I told her no, I was from Texas, just passing through. She smiled and said, "Nobody just passes through Manila. You either fall in love with it or you run away from it. Which one are you?" I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Then stay long enough to find out." Her name was Vivian Reyes. She told me she owned a restaurant in Makati, Filipino food, mostly family recipes, been running it for 6 years. She asked me what I used to do. I told her real estate development. She asked real questions, not polite questions, not small talk questions, actual questions about what it felt like to build something, whether I missed it, whether I was one of those men who retired and didn't know who they were without a project. That question landed somewhere deep. I told her honestly, yes, sometimes. She nodded like she already knew. By the end of the night, she had given me her number. Not because I asked, she just wrote it on a napkin and slid it across the bar and said, "If you stay long enough to find out about Manila, call me. I'll show you the city the tourists don't see." I folded that napkin and put it in my shirt pocket, and I flew home 3 days later thinking about her every single hour of that 15-hour flight. Not in a desperate way. In a way that felt like waking up after a very long sleep. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was just a pleasant conversation with an interesting woman in a beautiful city. I told myself that a 72-year-old man from Texas had no business feeling this alive over a napkin with a phone number on it. I told myself all of that. And then I got home and sat down at that empty dining table and picked up my phone and sent her a message before I'd even unpacked my suitcase. 6 weeks later, I was back in Manila. I told Bill I needed a follow-up trip. He raised an eyebrow and grinned, and I told him to mind his own business, which made him grin wider. I booked myself into a hotel in Makati for 10 days. Vivian met me at the lobby the first evening with that same quiet confidence, wearing a yellow dress this time, and she said, "You came back. So you're falling in love with it, not running." I said I thought so. She said, "Good. Come on, I'll take you somewhere real." She showed me a Manila I would not have found on my own. Narrow streets full of food stalls and laughing families. A fish market at 4 in the morning that smelled like the ocean and possibility at the same time. A small chapel on a hillside where she lit a candle and didn't explain why. She talked about her life plainly, without performing it. Her father had died when she was 20. She built the restaurant with her mother's help and her own savings over 10 years. She said, "I don't need anyone to rescue me. I've been rescuing myself since I was 20 years old." I believed her completely. That was the thing about Vivian in those early months. She was so convincing in her independence that my financial instincts, the ones I'd used to evaluate deals for 4 decades, went completely quiet. There was nothing to evaluate. She seemed to want nothing from me but time. On the 4th day of that trip, she took me to her restaurant. It was on a side street in Makati, small but clean. A hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Reyes Kitchen." Maybe 30 seats inside. The smell of garlic and pork and something sweet I couldn't identify. It was busy. A lunch rush, people eating with their heads down, servers moving fast. She introduced me to a woman named Ate Carmen who ran the floor and seemed genuinely fond of Vivian. I sat down and ate the best sinigang I'd ever had and watched her move through her own space with easy authority. This is real, I thought. This woman is real. I flew home after 10 days and came back 6 weeks later. Then again 2 months after that. Each time I stayed longer. By month 5, I was staying 3 weeks at a stretch. My daughter Stacy called me one Sunday evening and asked directly, "Dad, are you seeing someone?" I said yes. There was a pause. She said, "Who?" I told her Vivian's name, told her she owned a restaurant in Manila, told her she was smart and independent and not what Stacy was probably imagining. Stacy was quiet for a moment, and then she asked the question I didn't want to answer. She said, "How old is she, Dad?" I told her 44. Another pause. Then, "That's 28 years, Dad. Are you sure about this?" I told her I was sure about how it felt. She said, "That's not the same thing." I changed the subject. I told myself Stacy was being protective, and that was understandable. I told myself she just didn't know Vivian. What I didn't tell Stacy was what happened during month 7. We were walking along the bay at sunset, Vivienne and I, and she went quiet in a way she didn't usually. I asked her what was wrong. She shook her head. I asked again. She said, "It's nothing. I'll handle it." I stopped walking and turned to her and said, "Tell me." She looked at the water for a long moment. Then she said, "The suppliers. They changed the payment terms. And the landlord raised the rent by 30%. I've been carrying it for 3 months and I don't know how much longer I can keep the doors open." I asked how much she needed to stabilize things. She said, "Gerald, I'm not asking you for anything." I said, "I know you're not. I'm asking you what you need." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes filled. She said quietly, "Maybe 50,000. But I would pay you back. I would set up a proper repayment plan. This isn't charity. I'm a businesswoman. I don't take charity." I told her I didn't think of it as charity. I told her I thought of it as believing in something real. She leaned her head against my shoulder on that seawall, and the city lit up around us, and she said, "I don't need a man to take care of me, Gerald. I just want someone who stays." And I thought, this is it. This is the thing I've been missing. Not money, not property, not the next deal. This, right here. I pulled her close, and I thought about how long it had been since I felt like someone needed me to stay. I didn't see it then. I didn't see any of it. I just felt warm for the first time in years. I wired $50,000 the following Tuesday. I remember standing at my laptop in the hotel room doing the transfer with the same calm I used to have when I signed development contracts. I'd evaluated riskier deals than this on less sleep and less information. I told myself that. I told myself this was logical. The restaurant was real. I'd eaten in it. watched it operate, seen the signage and the staff and the lunch rush with my own eyes. The woman was real. The need was real. And I was a man who knew how to identify value in things other people overlooked. $50,000 to stabilize a functioning business owned by the woman I was falling in love with. I'd signed off on bigger risks without blinking. At least this one had a face I trusted. What happened next is what I want you to understand, because this is where it starts to make sense, in the worst possible way. 3 days after the transfer, Vivienne showed up at my hotel with dinner she'd cooked herself. Real food, in containers she carried in both arms, apologizing for the mess, laughing at herself for not thinking to bring a bag. We sat on the hotel room floor and ate adobo and rice, and she told me about the suppliers she'd already called, the new payment structure she'd negotiated, the renovations she was planning for the back wall. She was detailed and specific and grateful in a way that didn't feel performed. She said, "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself this week. I won't forget that." And then she said something else, softer. She said, "I love you, Gerald." First time she said it. Just like that. Quietly. Like it had been true for a while and she was just now letting it out. I said it back. Of course I did. I meant it. That's the part that nobody wants to hear. I meant every word of it. 3 weeks later, she mentioned her family wanted to meet me. She framed it carefully, no pressure. Whenever I was comfortable, they understood I was a private man. I told her I wanted to meet them. So one Sunday, we drove to her mother's house in a neighborhood just south of Makati, a modest house, clean and well kept, the smell of food already coming through the windows before we reached the door. Her mother, Remedios, opened the gate. She was 68, small and soft-spoken, with a smile that spread slowly, like she was deciding how much of it to give you. She took both my hands in hers and said, "Gerald, we have heard so much. Come in, come in." Her brother Jason was already at the table, 38, built wide, loud laugh, the kind of man who fills a room before he opens his mouth. He shook my hand hard and said, "So you're the man from Texas? You build houses? Big ones?" Her sister Chriselle sat near the window, quieter, younger looking than her 32 years, with a shy smile that genuinely reminded me of my daughter. I felt something relax in my chest when I looked at Chriselle. I thought, this family is good. This is a real family. We ate for 2 hours. The food kept coming. Remedios watched me the whole time with that wide, slow smile. Every time I looked up from my plate, she was watching, not rudely, just consistently. I thought she was proud of her daughter. I thought she was studying the man her daughter had chosen. I didn't think anything was wrong with that. Jason asked me about real estate development in Texas, what kinds of projects I'd done, what property values looked like, whether Americans were still investing internationally. I answered everything cheerfully. I thought he was curious. I thought it was just conversation. I thought a lot of things that afternoon that turned out to be completely wrong. But I remember sitting in the car on the way back and Vivian reaching over and squeezing my hand. She said, "They love you already." I looked at the road and felt full in a way I hadn't in years. Not from the food, from the belonging. The terrible thing about what came next is that it was built on something I actually needed. The loneliness was real. The hunger for connection was real. They found the exact door that was open, and they walked straight through it. I want to tell you about the 6 months that followed, and I want to tell you slowly, because when I lived through it, I didn't feel any of it as one continuous thing. I felt each moment separately. I felt each crisis as its own emergency. I felt each payment as its own isolated act of love. It's only when I look back now and line them all up that I can see what it actually was, a machine. Running on schedule, pulling levers in sequence, designed by someone who understood exactly how much a man like me could give before he started asking questions. It started with Remedios. 6 weeks after the family lunch, Vivian called me at 7 in the morning, her voice tight. She said, "Gerald, my mother is in the hospital. They found a blockage in her heart. The doctor says she needs surgery within the week or she's at serious risk." I asked which hospital. She told me. I asked if the surgery was scheduled. She said, "It's not. Gerald, the public hospitals don't have beds. The private hospital wants full payment up front. We don't have it." I asked how much. She said, $70,000. And then before I could respond, she said, "Gerald, I am not asking you for this. Please don't think I'm calling you, because I'm just scared. I don't know what to do, and you're the person I call when I don't know what to do." I wired the money the same afternoon. I told myself Remedios was a good woman. I told myself this was what you did for the people your person loved. The surgery happened. I was shown a photograph of Remedios in a hospital bed, tubes in her arm, smiling weakly. Vivian cried when she showed me. She said, "She's okay. She's going to be okay. Because of you." The nights that followed were the warmest we had. Vivienne was tender and close in a way that I'd started to associate with gratitude, without examining why those two things had become the same thing in my mind. I was $120,000 in. I didn't count it that way. I counted it as two problems solved for the people I cared about. Then came Jason. 10 weeks after the surgery, Vivienne called me again, this time later in the evening, and I could hear from her voice that she'd been crying before she dialed. She said, "Jason is in trouble. A business partner is suing him, claiming he owes money from a deal that fell apart. There's a warrant. Gerald, if he doesn't have a lawyer retained by the end of the week, they will arrest him." I asked what kind of numbers we were talking about. She said, "For everything. The lawyer, the court filing fees, getting the warrant suspended, $85,000. I was quiet. I'd been quiet a little longer on this one. She heard it. She said, "Gerald, I know this is too much. This is too much to ask. I'm not asking you. I don't know what else to do, and I can't watch my brother go to jail." I asked her why they didn't have any savings of their own for something like this. She said quietly, "Gerald, you know how we grew up. We don't have a safety net. We have each other, and whatever we can earn day by day." I wired the money 3 days later. $85,000 to a man I'd met once over adobo on a Sunday afternoon. I'm not going to dress that up. I made that decision. I knew the number was significant. I told myself that family was messy and expensive, and that real love meant real commitment, and that I'd spent 40 years building something precisely so that when moments like this came, I could help. The nights that followed were even warmer. Vivian started talking about our future, whether I'd consider living in Manila full-time, what our life might look like together. She said one evening, "I think about growing old next to you. Is that crazy?" I said no. I said it wasn't crazy at all. I was $205,000 in. I had no idea. 3 months after that, it was Chriselle's wedding. Vivian mentioned it carefully, almost sideways. "My sister is getting married, and I'm so happy for her, but the family doesn't have anything to give her. They've used everything on Mama and on Jason. Chriselle doesn't even know we can't afford the reception." I said, "How much?" Vivienne shook her head and said, "No, Gerald, I'm not doing this again. I can't keep." I said, "How much, Vivienne?" She said, 60,000. "But please, I'm not asking." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked genuinely ashamed. And I thought, this is a woman who hates having to rely on anyone. This is a woman who has been holding her family together her entire life and is humiliated by the fact that she needs help doing it. I thought that was love. I thought that shame was proof of her integrity. I wired the 60,000. I watched Chriselle's wedding photos come through on Vivian's phone a month later. A small ceremony, white dress, yellow flowers, a hall full of people I'd never meet. Vivian sent me a video of Chriselle crying happy tears and said, "She doesn't know what you did, but she's happy because of you." I sat with my phone in that hotel room and felt like a good man. I was $265,000 in. And somewhere underneath the warmth, in a place I refused to look directly, a voice I'd been silencing for months said, "Something is wrong. Something is very wrong." I closed my eyes and I chose not to hear it. I want to be honest about this chapter. Because the truth is, I knew, not everything, not the full picture, but I knew something. I felt it the way you feel. A change in pressure before a storm arrives. The air is different. You can't point to any one thing, but your body knows. My body knew for months before my mind admitted it, and I chose deliberately, repeatedly, consciously not to look. The restaurant was the first thing. After the $50,000 transfer, it was open for another 6 weeks, and then Vivienne told me they were closing temporarily for renovations. The permit situation was complicated, she said. The city had new requirements for commercial kitchens. It would be a few months. I visited once while it was closed, the shutters were down, a padlock on the door, the hand-painted sign still above the entrance. She told me the manager had quit and taken 2 of the best servers. I said that was bad timing. She agreed. She seemed frustrated and tired when she talked about it. I didn't ask to see the permit application. I didn't ask to speak with the landlord or the city official. I was a real estate developer for 30 years. I knew exactly which questions to ask about a commercial property dispute. I asked none of them, because asking those questions would have meant suspecting her, and suspecting her would have meant looking at everything else, and I was not ready to look at everything else. Her phone. I noticed the phone. It was always face down on the table when we ate together. Always. When it buzzed, she glanced at the screen from an angle I couldn't see, and then set it back down. When she took calls, she went to another room or stepped outside. She came back from those calls with a face that had been composed like she'd done the work of putting it back together before re-entering the room. I told myself she was a private person. I told myself not every woman wanted to share her entire phone life with the man she was with. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself these things with the same careful voice you'd use to talk a nervous man off a ledge. Remedios and Jason visited the house more than made sense. This was the house I was renting in a nice part of Makati, fully furnished at my expense, all the utilities in my name or Vivian's. A place she'd found, and I'd agreed to pay for because staying in hotels was starting to feel impersonal. Her family came by 2 or 3 times a week, always with food, always cheerful, always somehow steering conversations toward America. Jason asked me once whether I'd ever considered investing in Philippine real estate. I said maybe someday. He said, "You should. The market here is strong, especially for foreign buyers with capital." I thought he was being friendly. Remedios asked me once whether I owned my house in San Antonio outright. I said yes. She smiled her wide, slow smile and said, "That's very good, Gerald. Very stable." I thought she was expressing approval of my life. I was a fool. It was Pete Calloway who finally said out loud what I already knew. Pete was a 67-year-old American from Ohio who'd been living in Manila for 4 years. I'd met him through the original travel group, and we'd stayed in loose contact coffee once a month, sometimes dinner. He was plain-spoken in the way that only men who've been burned before can be. One evening over coffee in a place near Greenbelt, he looked at me steadily and said, "Gerald, I'm going to say something you're not going to want to hear." I said, "Fine, go ahead." He said, "I've been watching your situation for a few months. The family visits, the crises, the money going out. Brother, I've seen this before. Not once, 3, 4 times. The whole family is involved. This isn't a relationship. This is an operation. And I'm telling you right now as someone who likes you, be careful." I sat back and looked at him. I felt a cold thing move through my chest. And then, and this is the part I'm most ashamed of, I pushed it away. I said, "Pete, you don't know Vivian. You don't know her family. You're projecting someone else's story onto mine." He said, "I hope I'm wrong." I said, "You are." I left 20 minutes later and I avoided Pete for the next 2 months. I tell you this not to paint myself as stupid. I tell you this because I want you to understand what I was protecting. I wasn't protecting money. I wasn't protecting dignity. I was protecting the feeling of being wanted, of mattering to someone, of sitting in a warm house in a city full of life with a woman who said my name like it meant something. That feeling was worth more to me than anything my instincts were whispering. And I spent a significant portion of my retirement defending that feeling against the truth, until the night the truth walked into the room and I couldn't look away anymore. I need you to understand that I wasn't looking. I want to be completely clear about that. I was not suspicious that evening in any active way. We'd had a quiet dinner at home. She'd cooked, we'd eaten. There was soft music on the speaker, and she was humming along in the kitchen while I cleared the table. She told me she was going to shower and she'd be right back. The phone was on the kitchen counter, face up. That alone was unusual enough that I noticed it. It buzzed. I glanced over. The screen showed a name, Remedios, and a preview of a message in a mix of Tagalog and English that I could partially read. I saw a dollar amount. I saw a question mark, and I picked it up. I'm not going to pretend I hesitated. I picked it up and I read backward through 20 minutes of messages. My hands were steady. My heart was not. The exchange was a running account. Remedios asking for updates on balances. Vivienne responding with numbers. Both of them calculating how much was left and how much more they thought they could get before I started asking questions. There were laughing emojis. There were planning messages. After the next one, we slow down, don't push too fast. And there in the middle of the thread, in English, plain as anything. The stupid American keeps sending, doesn't even check. That sentence, I read it 3 times. The stupid American keeps sending. I set the phone back on the counter exactly as I found it. I stood at the kitchen counter and I looked at my hands. I couldn't feel them. And then I saw the other name, Rovik. It appeared deep in the conversation, not in context of the money discussion in a different thread that had been left open. Messages between Vivienne and someone named Rovik. Affectionate messages, recent. The last one was 2 days ago. I read enough to understand what they were. Not a brother, not a cousin, not a friend from the restaurant, someone who loved her in the private language of a person she'd been with for a long time. I closed the app. I set the phone down. I stood there. I don't know for how long. The shower stopped running. I heard her footsteps in the hall, and then she came around the corner in her robe, towel around her hair, and she looked at my face. She stopped. She didn't say anything. She didn't panic, didn't reach for the phone, didn't try to explain. She just went completely still. And that stillness, that total absence of surprise, told me everything I needed to know. She had been waiting for this moment. She had known it would come, and she was ready for it. That stillness was the most frightening thing I had ever seen in another person. She looked at the phone on the counter and then back at me. I said, "Who is Rovik?" My voice came out quieter than I expected. She didn't answer immediately. She walked to the counter and picked up the phone and turned it over in her hand. She said, "Gerald," just my name, like a period at the end of a sentence that had already ended. I said again, more slowly, "Who is Rovik?" Not a question this time. She set the phone down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not fear, not guilt, something emptier than all of those. And I understood, in that moment, that the woman I had known for the past 18 months had never actually existed. I had been living inside a very well-built room, and the walls were about to come down. I thought she would lie. I thought she would cry, or get angry, or reach for some version of the story that gave us a way out. I was prepared for all of that. What I was not prepared for was her absolute stillness. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her and looked at me like she was waiting for me to sit down too. I didn't sit. I stood in the middle of that kitchen that I had furnished and said, "Tell me who he is." "He's my boyfriend," she said. Just like that. No build-up, no softening. "He's been my boyfriend the whole time. He lives in Laguna, about 2 hours from here." I didn't move. I said, "The whole time?" She said, "Yes." I said, "The restaurant." She looked at me levelly. She said, "It was real for a while. We rented it for about 4 months. Long enough." I heard myself say, "Long enough for what?" She said, "Long enough for you to see it." I took a slow breath. I said, "Your mother's surgery." She tilted her head slightly. She said, "She had a procedure, a small one. It cost about $8,000. $70,000 had gone out." My mind was doing the arithmetic automatically, the way it always had in business, and the numbers were landing like weights. I said, "Jason's legal trouble." She looked at the table. She said, "There was no case." I said, "Chriselle's wedding." She said, "The wedding was real. The family just didn't need $60,000 for it." I stood there with the sum of it assembling itself in my head. $265,000 in direct transfers. Another $165,000 in everything else. The house, the furniture, the flights, the years. I said, why? She looked up at me. I said it again, quieter. Why? She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, Gerald, what did you expect? You're old and lonely. This is what you deserve. Those words left her mouth with no heat in them, no cruelty for its own sake. Just a statement, like a weather report, like something that simply was. I stared at her. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. She said, the house is under my cousin's name. You should probably start looking for somewhere else to stay. She stood up. She walked to the door. She opened it, and she left. I heard the door click shut. I heard her footsteps on the path outside. I heard a car start, and then there was nothing. Just me in that kitchen, in the quiet, in a house I had paid for that had never belonged to me, in a city that had nothing to do with me. With $430,000 gone, and a sentence ringing in my head like something had struck a bell that wouldn't stop. You're old and lonely. This is what you deserve. I didn't break anything. I didn't make a phone call. I didn't cry. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, on the floor, and I stayed there for a long time, not because I had lost $430,000, but because I was sitting alone in a kitchen I had furnished for a life that had never been real, and I could hear the refrigerator humming, and it sounded exactly like the refrigerator in my dining room in San Antonio, and I understood finally, completely, with the cold clarity of a man who has run out of things to tell himself, that I had traveled 12,000 miles and paid everything I had just to be alone in a different kitchen. I thought about everything I had ignored, every flag I had folded up and put away. Pete's face across the coffee table saying I've seen this before. Stacy's voice on the phone saying that's not the same thing. Remedio's watching me from the end of that Sunday lunch table with that wide, slow smile. Jason asking about Texas property values with his hand on his beer. Every single moment I had understood what was happening and chosen the warmth instead. I didn't blame Vivian that night. I blamed myself. That was the realest thing I'd felt in 18 months. It was also the worst. I checked into a hotel near NAIA, the Manila airport, the next morning. I didn't book a flight immediately. I couldn't. I sat in that hotel room for 3 days with the curtains drawn, ordering food I barely touched, watching the ceiling. I called Pete on the second day. The phone rang twice and he picked up and I said, "You were right." He said, "I know." He didn't say "I told you so." He asked which hotel. I told him. He said, "I'll come by at 6. He arrived at 6 exactly. He sat down in the chair by the window and didn't say anything for a while, and that silence was the most generous thing anyone gave me the whole time I was in Manila. We sat together for 2 hours and talked about nothing important, and I understood that sometimes a man just needs another man to stay in the room with him. I flew home on the 4th day. 12 hours in the air, feeling like I was being transported backward through time to a version of my life I had tried to escape. I landed in San Antonio on a Tuesday afternoon and called Stacy from the arrivals hall. I said, "I need to tell you something." She heard my voice and said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "No, not right now, but I will be." She drove down from Dallas the next morning. She sat at my kitchen table, that same empty kitchen table where this whole story started, and she listened to all of it. Every transfer, every crisis, every warm night that I now understood had been a reward for payment received. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm really sorry." Not one word about warning me. Not one word about what she'd said on the phone 18 months ago. Just, "I'm sorry." I held it together until that moment, and then I didn't. When I could think clearly enough to count, I counted. 265,000 in direct transfers, the restaurant, the surgery, the legal defense, the wedding, 165,000 in supporting costs, 12 months of house rent and utilities, furniture and appliances, 6 round-trip business class flights, gifts, dinners, the life we built that was never ours, $430,000. My retirement fund was not completely gone. I had other assets, property, some investments Vivian had never known about because I'd never thought to mention them. But the comfortable, quiet life I had planned, the life I told myself I was building when I moved that money, was no longer the life I had. I was 72 years old and I had to rethink what the next 15 years looked like. That was the financial truth. I consulted a lawyer the following week. He was patient and honest with me. He said cross-border fraud recovery cases in situations like mine were extraordinarily difficult, that pursuing civil action in the Philippines would require retaining Philippine counsel, establishing jurisdiction, and investing money that would likely exceed any recovery I could realistically obtain. He said I could file a police report in both countries for documentary purposes. He said I could report the wire transfers to my bank and to the relevant financial crimes units, though recovery was unlikely. He said he was sorry. I closed the file. There was nothing to chase. She had been too careful, too patient, too specific about what could and couldn't be proven. This was not an impulsive crime. It was a planned one. The money hurt. Of course it did. But what actually cost me most, and I've thought about this every day since, was the year and a half I spent believing I was finally loved again. That was the real price. Not the transfers, not the wire fees. The 18 months I gave to something that was never there. The feeling of her leaning against my shoulder on that seawall at sunset. The sound of her saying I love you for the first time. The warmth of those nights that I now understood were performance given in proportion to what I had just given, withdrawn when there was nothing to reward. I had purchased every warm moment I'd had with that woman. I had bought every smile, every touch, every soft thing she'd ever said to me in the dark. And what made it unbearable wasn't the cost. It was knowing I had done it knowingly, at some level, and chosen not to stop. 6 months later, on a Sunday evening in October, I sat down at my desk with a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote a letter to Vivian Reyes. I was not going to send it. I knew from the first line that I was not going to send it. But I needed to put the words somewhere outside of my own head, because I had been carrying them for too long and they had started to feel like weight. I wrote, Vivian, I am not writing this to get anything back. Not the money, not an apology, not an explanation. I've made peace with the fact that none of those things are coming. I'm writing because I have things to say that I need to say to someone, and you are the only person I can say them to honestly, even if you never read them. I don't hate you. I thought I would. For the first few months, I thought hatred was going to be the thing that kept me moving, but it wasn't. What came instead was something quieter and harder to carry. It was understanding. I understand that you grew up without a safety net in a country where that means something different than it does where I come from. I understand that a family's survival can justify things that an outsider would call wrong. I understand that a 68-year-old woman who spent her life watching her children struggle might look at a wealthy, lonely American man and see a solution rather than a person. I understand all of that. Understanding it doesn't make it right, but it makes it human. And I'd rather see you as human than spend the rest of my life seeing you as a monster, because monsters don't haunt you the way humans do. I wrote, what you said when you left, that I was old and lonely, that I deserved it, you weren't wrong about the first two things. I was old, I was lonely. But lonely men still deserve to be treated like people. That's the part I want you to think about. Not for my sake, but for yours. Because the man after me will be lonely too, and the man after him. And at some point, if you keep doing this, you will run out of men who can give you anything, and all you'll have left is who you've chosen to be. I wrote, what broke me wasn't the money. I want you to know that, even if it doesn't matter to you. What broke me was finding out that the version of you I loved, the woman on the seawall, the woman who ordered mineral water and asked me real questions, the woman who said she just wanted someone who stayed, that version never existed. You built her specifically for me. You found the exact shape of what I was missing and you filled it perfectly. That is a terrible talent. I hope you find something better to do with it. I wrote that last line 3 times before I decided to keep it. I folded the letter. I put it in an envelope. I did not write her name on it. I did not seal it. I walked outside onto my porch and sat in the chair I'd had out there for 15 years, the one with the faded green cushion, and I watched the sun go down over my street in San Antonio. The same street I'd left a year and a half ago, thinking I was running toward something. It looked different now, not worse, just more honest. The light was the same, the neighbors were the same. The sound of someone's lawnmower 2 houses down was the same, but I was not the same, and I was not sure yet whether the man I'd become was better or just more awake. Maybe those were the same thing. Maybe at 72, awake was the best you could ask for. I sat there until it was dark. I thought about Stacy. I thought about Pete sitting in that hotel room chair saying nothing and meaning everything. I thought about the Sunday lunch in Remedios's house and the food that kept coming, and the way I'd let myself feel like I belonged. I thought about what it cost me to chase that feeling. And I thought, I paid a lot to learn what I should have known at 30. But I'm still here, and that's worth something. I'm going to talk to you directly now. Not as Gerald Hutchins, retired real estate developer from Texas, cautionary tale. Just as a man who has been where you might be thinking about going, and who has something to say that you might not want to hear but need to. First, I am not telling you to stay away from the Philippines. I am not telling you that foreign love is a scam, that younger women are always predators, that any woman who shows warmth to an older Western man is running a play. None of that is what I'm saying. The Philippines is a beautiful country full of real people trying to live real lives. Most of what happened to me had nothing to do with a place and everything to do with a family that made a calculated decision and a man who helped them every step of the way. That man was me. I carry that. What I'm telling you is this. Look at what you're running from before you run somewhere. I went to Manila because I was lonely, because I was sitting at an empty table in a city I'd lived in for 40 years and feeling like a stranger in my own life. I carried that loneliness across 12,000 miles of ocean, and I handed it to a woman who knew exactly what to do with it. My loneliness was my vulnerability, not my age, not my money, my loneliness. That's the thing you have to address before you get on the plane, because if you board that flight already hungry, you will eat whatever is put in front of you, and you will not ask where it came from. Second, real love does not need saving. Not in the first 8 months, not in the second year. If a person's life requires your financial intervention early, before the relationship has had time to build real roots, that is not a coincidence. It is a design. I am a man who built buildings from the ground up. I understood construction. I understood how things were put together to serve a function. What Vivian and her family built was a construction. It had a foundation, my loneliness. It had framing, her independence and charm. It had walls, the family warmth, the restaurant, the credibility, and it had a purpose, extraction. I walked into it like a man who forgot he ever knew how to read a blueprint. Third, when the people who love you without agenda raise a concern, your daughter, your friend, a stranger at a coffee table who's been watching longer than you have, do not mistake their caution for jealousy. Stacy wasn't threatened by Vivian. Pete wasn't being cynical. They were seeing clearly because they didn't need what I needed. They could afford to look at the situation as it was. I could not. And that gap between what I could see and what I chose to see is where everything was lost. I am fine. I want to end by saying that clearly. I am not healed completely. There are evenings when I sit on this porch and I still feel the weight of that kitchen floor in Makati, and I still hear the refrigerator hum, and I still feel the size of what I lost, not just the money, but the hope that went with it. That doesn't go away overnight. But I am present. I am honest, maybe for the first time in years, with myself about what I want and what I'm willing to risk to get it. I talk to Stacy every Sunday. I had coffee with Bill last week and he didn't ask me anything about Manila, and I appreciated that more than I could explain. I am 72 years old and I know things now that I did not know a year ago, and some of those things are painful and some of them are just true. The painful ones and the true ones are usually the same. If you are a man sitting somewhere with a little money and a lot of loneliness and a dream of starting over somewhere warm and beautiful, I understand you completely. I was you. I just want you to know the full cost of going in blind. The flights are cheap. The loneliness you bring with you will cost you everything. Do the work first. Fix the thing inside. Then go anywhere you want. Just go as the man you actually are, not the man you're hoping someone else will turn you into. She won't. Nobody can do that for you. I know that now. I wish I'd known it before I paid $430,000 to learn it, but I'm still here, and sometimes, at 72, still here is enough.